Okay. Now I'm going to share screen. Okay. So, oh, 1 second, 1 second. I had to unplug the second monitor that I've got. It causes a problem. All right. So this lesson, this session, is about evolution, how organisms, including us, have had the capacity to change and keep moving on and modifying it over millions and millions of years. And it's basically, this talk is about how people over time have tried to make sense of how people have changed, but how we've moved on from animals and other situations. So I thought I'll start off with these. These are the main guys who we talk about. There's a fellow called Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, the 18th, 19th century. I'll go into detail about each of these in a sec, but he was talking about the transmission of acquired traits, of acquired capacities of organisms. Then Alfred Russel Wallace, he talked about intelligent evolution, which you may or may not have heard of before. And he was in the 19th, 20th century. So, and this, you've all heard of Charles Darwin, and he came up with the idea of survival of the fittest. So 19th century. And then what we have now is what we call neo-Darwinism, or the new Darwinism, which combines Darwin's ideas, which are still relevant, with modern genetics. And we use the genetics to explain what Darwin suggested. And we still move along with that. So the basics, the Lamarckian ideas are that an organism changes, because this is an idea, because it uses its part of the body, and as it uses a part of the body changes, and that's passed on to the offspring. So, for example, this is a very, very old diagram. I found a copy of it, of this giraffe on the left. And this giraffe was, eating whatever he could get, but then he found he liked the leaves. So as time went on, as the trees got, when you have a lot of animals, they all eat at the same level, but then others stretch their necks a little bit more to get higher and higher and higher. So the idea was that as you stretch your neck, your longer neck is passed on to your offspring. Okay, that's for Lamarckian evolution. It's, of course, being disputed. Wallace went into what's called intelligent evolution. And he was a theologian. He was a minister of religion. And he basically said it's a relation to natural theology. The idea that is that it's all organized by some higher being, like which we call a god. So this is this concept of intelligent evolution is it's directed by a higher being. We know about higher beings. So, and it's detectably designed. So you can actually pick what parts of it are designed and how they're designed. And it has a purposeful common descent. So you can actually follow the descent backwards and you can show how things have changed. So like the giraffe, you look back at the shorter neck giraffes over time. Then Darwin came along and he came up with the idea of natural selection. He wasn't the only one, there were a couple of others, but he was the one that everybody talks and understands about. So this natural selection is when there are consistent effects on survival or reproduction within a certain population. So the key mechanism here is, this is of evolution. It's consistent effects on the survival or reproduction of members of the population. I highlighted really, really important. And that statement will make sense as we go along. So we have a thing called genetic variation. This is way beyond Darwin. They had no idea of genetics in those days, but they did have an idea that it was something within people or animals or plants that allowed them to survive and to reproduce and produce beings or plants or whatever that will look exactly like the parents. But genetics is something that they had no idea about. And the idea of this today of genetic variation, because we're all slightly different, even identical twins are slightly different, that they have the capacity to survive and reproduce, but sometimes a bit more successfully, sometimes a bit less successfully, depending on their environment, because they are involved with their environment. I mean, we all are, whatever environment it is, whether we live in a cave or we live in a palace, the food we eat, the temperature, the amount of water that's around, all that sort of thing. So Darwin's ideas were so foreign in England. This is a very, very famous cartoon of Darwin that was in one of the newspapers. And that caused a lot of laughter from people. This is what it's about. The idea that we evolved from chimpanzees, from monkeys. Okay, so people took it seriously, but then others said, impossible. Look how different we are. Okay, so that was a problem that he had. So here's a little diagram of showing the difference. So the top row is what Lamarck said. The animal stretches its neck, going food higher and higher and higher because they're successful, so they're reproducing, so they're all eating the same trees. The leaves happen to be a bit higher, and then the neck got longer. On the other hand, Darwin and Wallace, even though he was a theologian, they both said that within a group, animals, in this case the giraffes, are born with different length necks. So Darwin would have said through the reproductive process, Wallace would have said, oh, God made that happen. But it's a natural selection is basically the way that comes out. Okay, so there are changes that are happening in us. People are changing now all the time, but they will only be successful if the change that is happening fits into the particular environment that they live in. Okay, let's get some definitions. We talk about species. So what is a species? And this is a very, very important definition. It's a group, a species, a group of organisms that can reproduce in nature, that means no help from man, and produce viable, that means they're able to live, and fertile, that can reproduce, offspring. So their offspring can then pass on their genetic information. So they reproduce in nature and they produce offspring that can live long enough to reproduce, then it also be fertile. Now, evolution within a species is, like man, there are two aspects. There's nature and nurture. Nature is the genetics. Nurture is the environment. Okay. And then the concept of the environment is now called epigenetics. I don't know if you've heard of it at all, but it's been around for a few years. And it's basically, I'll go into more detail, but basically epigenetics is modifications to your genome, your genetic information, due to the environment that you're in. So the genetics is changed, not really the genetics, but the effect on the genetics, and that effect becomes part of the genetics. It's an extra bit. So evolution actually occurs due to geography and environment. So when the geography changes, or the environment changes, or both, things have to happen for the organisms to survive. So, for example, as we are now, with all the rain that we've been happening, with all the fires we've had, the huge amount of lack of rain in other places, the heat. So, for example, animals that may have lived, or plants that lived at the base of a mountain, with increased heat, they're actually moving up the mountain. They'll keep moving, looking for cooler areas. And then to be able to survive in the cooler areas when it gets colder, as they go higher, they have to change. So then the geography changes, the environment changes. And that is, evolution is happening regardless. But those that can survive the dryness more, or those that can survive the wetness more, or the lower temperature, the higher temperature, they will survive more than the others who don't have the capacity to survive those changes. Now, when the DNA changes due to mutations, there would be variations in the offspring. So I'm assuming we all have had kids, being twins or not twins. They're all different. There are lots of similarities with your kids to you and your parents or your in-laws, and they have half of your genes. The other half came from your partner. But through the process of producing the eggs, the sperm, variations come up. There's another talk I give on genetics, which explains this process in the process called meiosis, but not today, if you don't mind. Time is it may be a problem if I start with that. It's a pretty big topic. Okay, so these variations could give a population, because it moves through the population, a survival advantage. But you won't know until the environment changes. Could be the temperature, could be the amount of moisture, whatever it might be. Maybe even a change in with animals and plants of things that eat it, or their food supply. It could be anything. So these changes really don't display themselves until there's a change. Okay. Now, these changes are gradual, usually very, very gradual, and there's an accumulation. So, for example, if you think of each of us, both our parents had changes. Their parents, so the 4 grandparents, they would have had changes. and their parents, your great-grandparents, 8 of them, they would have had changes. And slowly, slowly, all these changes come together and they do work together. But again, with this accumulation, they will only be available to you as something that's useful if your environment changes. Now, we know that, for example, a basic one is the temperatures that people live in. So if you're in Central Australia, you're in Africa, you cope with the heat very, very well. You just do your work, you do everything in the heat. If you go up to Alaska, where it's cold, very cold most of the year, you adapt. And you've got the capacity, that's the point, the capacity to adapt to that environment. So humans are amazing. People who live in the Himalayas and live at very high levels, if we go there, we would have problems walking because of the level of oxygen. They have modified, they have had modifications, if you like, to their hemoglobin, and they can survive with a lot less, well, the oxygen is picked up in a different way. That makes sense. Anyway, so this is just what I was saying. If there are changes to the climate, the food, the water, predators coming in, or predators disappearing, some population will be able to survive better than others. So I mentioned predators disappearing. They may end up with predators, or they just die off for some reason. Then the numbers of, because predators keep populations intact with numbers, and then the amount of food that's available for that population is right. But if you get predators that disappear or move on because the environment has changed or something, then the amount of food that's available because of the increase in population, that may cause a problem. So all this is now, and this is what Darwin said, it's called survival of the fittest, not the fittest who can run the fastest. Well, sometimes yes, especially if there's a lion running behind you. But the fittest means surviving a particular environment. As the environments change, and we are getting warmer and warmer, some organisms will die off and others will increase in population. So let's look at different types of evolution. We have a major one called convergent evolution. And this is where different organisms, unrelated, totally, they develop similar traits for the same environment. They live in the same environment, and because of the environment, with the amount of water, the amount of heat, the amount of whatever, they develop over time similar traits, similar functions, similar ways of surviving, but they're not related. They don't reproduce with each other. And this occurs in, it could be similar environments in different parts of the world. And I'll show you some examples in a sec. So, for example, I was thinking of another example, but these two, the thylacine or the Tasmanian tiger, died out now. It's a marsupial. The dingo, placental, like us. They're dogs, they're marsupials. They look the same. They work the same way. They have the same way of eating, the same way of catching their prey, whatever. This is what's called convergent evolution. For what they had to do to survive, they developed this particular anatomical structure. With fish, for example, and he's an orca, It's a mammal, the fish, the same streamlined anatomy to be able to move fast in the water. So the least amount of resistance to the water, in the water, I mean. Okay, so the fish maybe from one part of the world, the mammal from other part, all sorts of things. This is what I was thinking of. In Africa, there are two lakes. One's called Lake Tanganyika, and the other one's called Lake Malawi. Each lake has about 300 species of a particular type of fish. It's called a mouth-brooding cichlid, where they this blue picture down here, there's the fish. It's only a little fish, but it carries its young in its mouth. So it's not the young are not eaten by other fish. Okay. So we're talking about two lakes and these fish. So here is Lake Tanganyika, and this is the one in Malawi. Now, if you look at them, they're both similar in shape. Very long, very narrow, and lots of ins and outs. Okay, so this is the best map I could get. So we have this, remember, of convergent evolution. Convergent meaning coming together. Those two lakes are a long way apart. The fish have no way of mixing with them, reproducing with them. There's no relationship between them. And they're about 350 kilometers from each other. They're both freshwater. Lake Tanganyika, 673 kilometers long and 72 wide. And Lake Malawi is not that far off it, 580 and 75 wide. And these are some of the species. And these are the colors of the species, by the way. Now, if you look at the name, and if you're not sure about the names, don't worry about them. The first name with a capital letter is the generic name, the genus, and the second name is the species name. So if you look at this top one, Julidochromis ornatus, it looks the same as this other one, Melanochromis auratus. The names are man developed, humans develop them. They're not the same species. If you put a bunch of them, of each of those in the one lake, in one area, they won't even talk to each other. Even though they look the same. So this is what happened with all these, and there are many, many, many more. Even these with these little bulbous bits on their heads. Now these ones are thin, these are larger, and these with these huge lips. So we've got this situation where you've got no competition between, no, that's the wrong word. No meeting of the species on either lake, and you get this development over millions of years. Okay, that's called that. It's convergent evolution. Here's another one, mammals. So we have burrowers, so this is placental, and these are Australian marsupials. So those are burrows. So we've got anteaters, the mouse type. These are climbers, the gliders, the cats, the wolf. So we've got this. I've given you these pictures in the notes. You can have a closer look at them. But the placental mammals were not in Australia. The only placental mammal that was in Australia was brought in by Aborigines, and that was a dingo. It came from Indonesia, I think. And so this is called convergent. It's a very important evolutionary concept. In different parts of the world, which have similar environments, the animals and plants develop very, very, very similar characteristics. Even their digestive systems are the same in each of these, or very similar. So here are these, for example, these water animals. So we have a reptile, we have a fish, we have a mammal, and we have a bird. They all live in water. They all survive very nicely, while ichthyosaur is long gone. But the shape of it is the same. The mechanism for propulsion is the same. So, except for the bird, because it uses its flaps. So this is a beautiful example, another example of an environment and evolution, and they look the same, convergent. And then we have another sort called divergent, which is the opposite. So we have differences in between species which are not related, which are related, but from a long time ago, and depends on where they live, they change to suit their new environments. So, for example, these two mantids, this one lives in Malaysia and this one in Africa. So the stick mantid is quite obvious to us because of the photo, but if you walk past it, you wouldn't see it. So there's the mantid there. Okay, this one is a bit harder to see. I have to look for it each time, but there's a leg there, and there's the head, there's the body, and hind legs, front other leg. And because it lives within around flowers, it looks like the flower. So its predators would, well, two of them, both there, whatever their predators are, would have trouble finding them. So we have different isolated geographic environments. So they can't reproduce with each other, but the changes happen. And so this is called the same species, original species, but they've diverged depending on their environment. And it's called divergent evolution. So I left that there. So we have this thing called reproductive isolation, and which I didn't mention before. Well, I did mention that they weren't near each other, different parts of the world. So they're isolated, but through natural selection, they're able to survive better than others that haven't changed. So the ones that haven't changed will die out, they'll be eaten by whatever eats them, and they will survive. And again, we're talking millions of years. It's not something that happens it's gradual, it's not something that happens quickly. Here's some other mantids. So these from different parts of the world, and they all look slightly different. This one looks a bit like the flower one that we saw. This one's a bit difficult to see, but there's the head. And that looks like another one. I'd say the big one is the female, and that's the male on top of it, ready to reproduce. Here's another one. This is probably the male. As you can see, he's reproducing down the bottom here. and that's the female. And if it goes according to, the same with those two. So what normally happens is after the female has been copulated and the male's passed on the sperm, he makes a run for it. Because if he's too slow, he'll be eaten. Because the female needs his protein, the protein that the male has, to help for the development of the eggs. But this is all divergent. The same type of animal around the world, they look different. If you look at these birds, same sort of bird is what's called the original species, and depending on what this one eats, insects and nectar. This one eats insects under bark. This one feeds on nectar from a particular flower, and I have no idea what the Ohia flower is. This is another one, the same group of birds, and depending on what they eat, this one you can see very powerful beaks, so it crushes seeds. This one is the nectar feeder, but with a flower that has like a tube. Even in butterflies, there's the original flower, and over time, there's one lineage, one line in the lineage, another one. It's basically the same, the sizes change depending on the environment. This is very interesting. In mammals, all mammals, except a couple, have the same number of bones in more or less the same place. So this is an example: humans, the cat, the bat, and the whale, and the group of bones in, say, well, with us, the phalanges, they're the fingers, the carpals and the metacarpals, that's the hand part, the ulna and the radius, that's the forearm, humerus is the upper arm. Now, these four animals, the colors there you'll see, they have been modified to help them, or to allow them to survive the best possible way that they can. And so a bat needs to be able to fly. So these fingers, like ours, and the same with the whale. Of course, the bones are much bigger, but it's the same structure. And that, folks, is called divergent evolution. So they've moved apart from each other. These guys, none of them can reproduce with each other. Around the world, so anteaters. So we have in Australia the pangolin. That's right. In Africa, the anteater in South America, the armadillo in North America, and this is meant to represent the echidna, I think. The beaky, the mouth part is a bit too long for the diagram, but it's the same group of animals. Don't forget, all land mass in the world was one, and it's slowly separated. And that happened, I think, 7 or 8 times over the history of the world. They come together and then they separate. So animals have been able to move together. Antarctica was part, and Australia, South America, India, were all part of Gondwana land. It was all part of, yeah. Anyway, now this, I'll introduce you to another concept. It's called a cladogram. What's related to what, with a timeline. So here we talk about millions of years, down to 60 million. And we call these ancestral primates. So that's where they started. And where this line comes up here we have what's called the common ancestor. So this common ancestor would have been the ancestor of this line and of this line here, which then split, and they have a separate common ancestor and another one here and another one. So eventually we made it to humans. But all of these are primates of some sort. Right? So this common ancestor was about 6 million years ago. Well, from between when we separated from the chimps. Oh, well, not we. Whatever the organisms were then looked quite different. Okay, so common ancestors are very important. And if you look at these, the chimpanzee is our closest relative animal-wise, then the gorilla, the orangutans, the gibbons, and then move further and further back in our ancestry. And you can see that they look different, they are different, but they're similar. Here is another one on the Galapagos. Now, the Galapagos Islands are made up of a number of islands. And the original finch was probably caught in some sort of a storm or something off the South American mainland, probably Peru or somewhere like that. And in fact, we were there, oh gosh, a few years ago, and landed on a group of them would have been flying, picked up by the wind and taken there. And they would have landed on various islands. And each island in the Galapagos is slightly different. And then each of these, if you see, you have seed eaters, cactus flowers, and bud eaters, insect eaters, and so on. They evolved to suit their environment. Those that could not evolve, or those that could not eat what was there because of their beak shape or the capacity to find whatever it is to eat, will just die off. Others obviously did survive and modify and keep changing. And if you look at the insect eaters, there's a whole range of them there. And it's the beaks that gave them a path. So when Darwin was sailing around, he ended up there and he took these samples of these birds. He went from island to island and took samples of and noted where they were from. And this is where his ideas were coming through. How is it possible that you, from this little guy down the bottom here, you end up with all these differences, and they were so close together geographically, but what was on each island was different. So they adapted, they evolved to be able to eat whatever was there. Now, Alfred Russel Wallace, he did a lot of work, field work, and he was in the Amazon River basin for a long time. And then he went to the Malay Archipelago. And in 1859, he identified that, or he noticed that the animals, it's called the faunal divide, fauna as opposed to flora, fauna animals, there was a section there where there were certain animals on one side and other animals on the other side. So he devised the Wallace line. He didn't call it that, of course. He didn't call it after himself, but he wrote extensively about this with lots of examples. A few years later, Thomas Huxley, he named it the Wallace line. So it separates the Indonesian archipelago into two parts. Those on the west were largely Asian animals, and those to the east were largely Australasian animals. And so this idea of this geographical distribution of the plants and the animals in that whole area, Wallace was called the father of biogeography, how animals and plants are spread across the geography of the world. So this is the Wallace line here. This is the one Wallace devised, and then it got modified by Huxley and made this way. Okay, so we have the Asian side, but this is the one that they're using, the dotted line, and all the rest are the Australasian side. Okay, now I've been talking about millions of years. There's a geological time scale. Now, this might look a little bit confusing, but this left one here, it goes from 4.6 billion years, which is about the time the Earth formed, we estimate. Now, over the billions and billions of years, things have changed, and these changes can be seen, usually in the rocks at this stage, at this early stage. And this is called from here to 500 million years ago. So we're talking about 4 billion years. It took basically for the Earth to form. 4 billion of the 4, well, yeah, probably the Cambrian. But in this area here, you also started getting the Proterozoic. Now, the Zo bit, Z-O, when you see that, it usually refers to something living, like in a zoo, okay? And then this top bit here, from that line, the dotted line there, to this one, the Paleozoic, is that, all of that, so spread it out. And you've probably heard of the Cambrian, the Ordovician, and so on, Devonian, Triassic, Jurassic Park. So this is time of the dinosaurs. So plants and animals have gone a long, long way over these 300 million or 300 million years. This is a big, big growth of plants and animals around the Earth because there was enough water, the Earth has cooled down enough, there was soil, there was rain, and the algae developed, there was a lot of oxygen in the air after a while. We're talking hundreds of millions of years. And eventually the plants moved to land, and then the animals in the water moved to the land, and so on. So we're talking a long time. The top bit here, from the tertiary level to 0, is this bit, and that's spread out more. By the way, 250 million years ago is when the dinosaurs type animals started to form, and at 65 million, which is the beginning of this spot here, is when they died out due to that what's called the nuclear winter, when that huge asteroid hit southern North America and sent up so much material, soil and sand and dust over. It went around the jet streams high up in the atmosphere, would have spread the whole thing out, and a lot of it was like a nuclear winter. That's what it's called. The sun couldn't get through, so all the big animals died, all of them, and a lot of the plants died, and then new ones started. Once all this muck, all the dust and rock and soil came down. And by the way, if you go around the world at certain types of soil, and you dig down, you will find a line of this. It looks like clay, a yellowish line, And that is when all this material settled back to Earth. And above that line is this right-hand column. And I think maybe that's why they put that color into the tertiary. Okay, stromatolites. These are in Western Australia. They're very common in the Precambrian, the 1.5 billion years in here. These were bacteria that grew. There are lots of them. I've seen these in WA, in mid coast, partly up. Yeah, they're right on the beach there. So these bacteria just grew and grew, and as they died, new ones grew, and they're like a very hard. They're not coral. They're like a rock made of dead bacteria. Very early. Okay, so this is very early life. The idea of common ancestors, I mentioned it once, I'll mention it again, because it's so important. So let's say there are 4 species, and A and B are related because they had a common ancestor. C and D are related because they had a common ancestor. But further back in time, ancestor 1 and ancestor 2 had a common ancestor. So these 4, A, B, C, D, are actually related distantly. Okay, that's the concept. So all these, like all mammals would have had a common ancestor way back whenever. Okay, and then they modified, and depending on where they lived and what they had to eat and all that sort of thing, they changed. So, for example, here these are some of today's primates. So we have early monkeys, and these are fossil primates. So they all came from this earliest common ancestor, and there's a timeline up here. So 98 million years ago. Now, all these are around the world, different parts of the world. So the lemurs and the lorises and tarsiers were in Africa, New World monkeys in South America, Old World monkeys in Africa with apes, and then eventually humans in Africa. So I will leave I'll leave human evolution to the next talk in the fortnight, but these are our latest their closest ancestors. So our ancestor, we could say it goes back to this really, really early one, 85 million years ago. But the Homo group is much, much more recent. Here's an example of common ancestors of horses. So we have the Hyracotherium, the Eohippus, this one here. Now he was the size of a terrier, a small dog. It had hooves on 4 front toes. The hooves are made of the same as our fingernails, the same as our hair, keratin. So like we have fingernails on each hand, or each finger. And by the way, without fingernails, we would not be able to pick anything up. They give stability to the end of the finger. So this guy here, Eohippus, was around 50 million years ago. And then you've got the Mesohippus, about 25 million years ago, but it's about the size of a collie, a dog, and with 3 toes. So move from 4 to 3. And then this one, the bigger one, the Mercohippus, had 3 toes on all feet and with vestigial toes. Now, vestigial means the parts of the body that aren't useful anymore. They're just sitting there. So they have toes higher up the bottom of it. And you can see here the bones, how it's changed over 50 million years. So the modern horse, there are lots of varieties today, but they all move on the middle toe. So they actually walk on their middle toe, and the others are a bit higher up. Often they get cut off because they're not well developed and they just accumulate rubbish. So, and so the hoof is equivalent to our fingernails, and it covers the whole middle finger. So it actually walks on its fingernail, if you like. Now you cut your fingernails, otherwise they get very long and very difficult to live with. And the same with horses. They get cut, they get ground as they walk, or they run, or whatever the horses move around on gravel. They don't feel the gravel, but that rubs it down. So it's like using emery paper or a file. However, with modern horses, they put hooves on them, and horseshoes on them, and the hooves then don't get worn down, so they've got to be filed down by their owners. Now, a little bit of genetics. Everything, all living things are made up of many different sorts of molecules, proteins, fats, sugars, nuclear sort of DNA sort of molecules without going into details. Now, the important ones here at the moment are the proteins, and we've got 7 different types of proteins in our bodies. And any changes to any of these proteins is called a mutation. Now, mutations are actually happening regularly in all of us, but usually they don't go anywhere because the mutation is non-functional and will just be destroyed by the cleanup crew that are moving through us all the time. But sometimes they can be useful. And if you think about humans, the variety of humans that we've got around the world, what we look like and how we survive in different environments, these mutations have come in very handy. Now, often the mutations are so that they're detrimental, even in the fetus, and you just get a miscarriage caused by the mutation. But we all have these mutations, and they're not detrimental, but we're still here after 60 or 70 or 80 years, but we won't know if they're any use to us unless we go to an environment that's a bit different, and the mutation will suit that particular environment. But no two people have exactly the same. So the people who have moved from, I don't know, say Southern Africa to Central Africa, or from Central Africa to Southern Africa, over the years, from the very hot to the cool, some will survive and some will not. Those who ended up in the Arctic Circle, the Eskimos, for example, they survived very, very nicely, comfortably. Most of us couldn't handle that in the cold the whole time. But they have a mutation still out. People who live in the Kalahari Desert, it's hot the whole time. It's dry the whole time. They don't have any problems. They just wander around. It's the same with the Australian Aborigines. But I'll talk about humans next time. So, any change in the environment, if the environment gets wetter, colder, hotter, drier, whatever, some organisms, forget man, because we build shelters, but animals themselves will, and plants and bacteria. Some will survive better than others as the environment changes. And that's called, as Darwin said, survival of the fittest. And by surviving in a different environment and reproducing, then that's the environment you can survive in quite comfortably, and your offspring will then survive there too. So just to understand what we're talking about to some degree, this is a very basic diagram and it looks confusing, but it's not. I'll go through bit by bit. Without explaining the chemistry, the DNA, this red one here, when a protein needs to be made, a section of DNA is opened up and this thing called RNA polymerase, it's a molecule that moves along and produces this blue thing here called messenger RNA, mRNA. Now, most of you had not heard of messenger RNA before COVID. Now it's on our lips all the time, mRNA. And mRNA, and I'll take this opportunity to give you an idea of the vaccine as well. So whatever protein we need, there has to be a section of DNA, which then this enzyme, but you know it's an enzyme because it ends in the ASE, all enzymes do that, the word, the name, and it produces that. And that is the messenger RNA. The messenger RNA then comes through the nuclear membrane, which has got lots of holes in it, like this one. I mean, I'm picturing the big, for me, it's quite easy to picture, but that's why I'm just describing it like a hole. And out comes this messenger RNA. It could be quite long, could be quite short too. And this messenger RNA has got the opposite nucleotides, the information from the DNA. And then we've got these things called transfer RNA. So you got the messenger RNA, you got the transfer RNA, that's the second sort, and then you get a third type of RNA called the ribosomal RNA. It's a matter of two parts. And so this big green thing here captures the messenger RNA. These guys here bring in the amino acids according to each of these codes. Each code's got 3. And then links them together, and then the protein is formed. Now, the bond between each 2 amino acids is called a peptide bond. And when you've got a whole stack of these peptide bonds, it's called a polypeptide chain. And this is the pre-protein. And then from there, it goes to wherever it has to go. Okay? Now, when there's a mutation somewhere in the DNA, the mutations are in the DNA, then they will, as you can see, end up changing the protein. And if the protein changes in a particular way, a good way or a bad way, if it's a bad way, the protein may just not be useful at all. If it's a good way, it may help the evolutionary process. And if it's just good as in everyday good, then it works because we are alive and you're sitting here with me. So it's very useful. And just quickly with the vaccine, what the vaccine does, it takes they take the messenger RNA, which produces a protein, which then the immune system will react to. And by reacting to it, then you become develop immunity. So if this piece of mRNA, messenger RNA, is injected into us, it moves into the cells, no problem, and then the mechanism will produce a protein, which then is removed from the cell into the bloodstream. And then the immune system says, hey, we've got a problem here. And the message goes out, certain chemicals are released, and these new proteins, which have been, or at least the proteins that have been produced by the cell, which mimic the if you like, the little arms on the COVID virus, which we don't normally have in our bodies, they get absorbed. And that leads to a huge armada of a huge explosion of antibodies in our bodies against little bits of the surface of the virus. So when the virus comes into us, whichever way it comes in, usually through the nose, there are lots of these around, but after a while they sort of disintegrate, and that's why we need boosters to keep it going. But then very quickly gets rid of it, of the coronavirus that comes into us. And that's the idea, and it works. So we're just trying to decide whether to here, my wife and I, whether we get the 5th injection, the 3rd booster now, or wait a bit closer to winter. So not sure. Anyway, with mutations, so this is, by the way, this is just a tiny little bit of genetics. If you have different types of mutations, different things happen. So here's a tiny little bit of DNA, and these nucleotides are called A, B, C, D, E, F. If you delete the B, you get a totally different protein form. If you duplicate something like the B, you get 2B. Again, this one and this one are totally different. So you get a new type of protein form. If you get an inversion where instead of having A, B, C, D, E, F, you get A, E, D, C, B, F. Again, totally different form, totally different protein. So this is all part of the mutation process, which would produce new proteins, which may be useful or may not. And this leads to evolution. But only useful in evolution if the environment changes to suit the mutation that we've got. Okay, so it's nothing's written in stone. It just depends what individuals have and what environment they end up in. And when we say environment, forget humans. It's more about the plants and animals that live outside the whole time. And then you get also translocation, but I won't go there. Okay, what evidence is there for evolution? And so we have fossils, radioactive dating, homology, analogy, I'll go through these, comparative embryology, vestigial structures, observed natural selection, biogeography, epigenetics, and biochemistry. So when we talk about fossils, which is the first one, an animal or a plant, they die. They usually where it's wet, where the water is not flowing. If it is, it's not very fast at all. Usually a lake. The animal's in there, dies, and it eventually gets surrounded by sediment. And millions of years later, it's the sediment then gets washed away, and they get the exposure of the fossil. Okay. Okay, I've just gone through that. So here we have a typical land cross-section, a profile, and the different types of rocks depending on where the soil has come in from. I won't go into the geology, but you can have looked down the bottom here. You've got trilobites, you've got some early fish, you've got some early, whatever they are, reptiles, I think. Yeah, definitely big reptiles. But these are sea creatures as well, land creatures, there's humans, okay, over in layers. And then they get, the soil gets washed away, gets blown away, and then they arise. So you can dig around it. So now we have a situation now. Each of these animals has died, and there are minerals inside within our bones, and you get a mineral exchange between the minerals in the bone and the soil it's in. There's just an exchange, and then the fossil becomes petrified. Now, the petra bit is Greek for stone. They become stone-like. So you get petrified. So the fossils that we have are really a form of rock, form of stone, which is then cleaned up and displayed. And of course, the lower the layer, the older the fossil. But sometimes you get inversions with movement of the earth, and it flips the other way. So it has happened where people think something is old when it's actually not. Radioactive dating, we have in our atmosphere various gases. Then nitrogen, nitrogen has 14 protons and neutrons, and now the cosmic rays cause neutrons moving around in the upper atmosphere, and a neutron hits a nitrogen atom, it will pick up, the neutron will go in, but it'll maybe dislodge a protein. So from nitrogen 14, you end up with carbon 14, because nitrogen has got 7 protons, carbon has got 6. So it goes according to the number of protons. But so this has got 7 protons, the nitrogen, 7 protons, 7 neutrons. This one's now got 6 protons and 8 neutrons. So it becomes radioactive. Then that carbon, as in the form of carbon dioxide, is absorbed by the plant and produces food. And of course, by the grass, the cow eats the grass. And then it dies, whatever the animal is. And then you have it has its carbon, part of its carbon in it is carbon 14, which is radioactive. Okay, so carbon 14 has a half-life of 5,730 years. So if you have let's say a gram of carbon 14, it takes 5,730 years before you have half a gram. Then you've got wait another so many years till you have a quarter of a gram. Now these can be measured with modern instruments. The carbon 12 stays the same the whole time. So there's a ratio in all of us have a ratio of carbon 12 to carbon 14. And by knowing what the ratio is in current animals and plants, and then getting the ratio in fossils, you can get up to fairly accurate years, up to 60,000 years going back in time. Now that is called the absolute time or absolute age, because they know exactly, according to the ratio, how many years have gone back. So older than this, they can't use the carbon-14 dating. They have to date the rock that the fossil is in. So that's called a relative age, but it's not as accurate, but it's relatively accurate because it probably died close to the time. We're talking about a few years, perhaps. That over millions of years, it makes a little difference. Now, we have other forms of radioactive dating. So uranium, when it breaks down, becomes lead. And that's good for between 1,000 and 1,000,000 years. So half-life of uranium is 710 million years. So if you've got a gram of uranium, it takes 710 million years for that to break down to half a gram. Potassium argon is another very common form of dating, and that's good for up to about 500,000, half a million years, maybe a bit longer, and it's got 1,300 million year half-life. Now, I'm aware of the time, so I'll ask you, you've got this in your notes, go back, and this is a very, very interesting 2 minutes to watch on half-life, on radioactive dating. So what happens here, this is a standard graph. As the parent isotope, the carbon-14, that is an animal sort of ate through the process of living, it has half a life. Okay, so we said it was 5,730 years. So a half-life there, 5,730 years is half time. So as that disintegrates, you get what's called a daughter isotope increasing. And as time goes on, so half it's gone, a quarter is left, an eighth is left until nothing. So using this idea is where the dating comes in. All right, another form of evidence for evolution, homology and analogy. Homology is when you have the same origin of a plant or animal, but you have a different part of a plant or animal, but you have a different function. So for example, in humans, these are scapula, the humerus, these bones, what I showed you before. In dogs, they're all the same bones. What I showed you, like I showed you before, the seal and the bird. We all originated in the same basis. So this is homology, homologous evolution. So that all these creatures, including us, evolved with the same bone structure, but modified to suit our, in this case, locomotion. Analogy is the same function, but a different origin. So we have wings, we have birds, we have reptiles, we have mammals. So the development of the wing is not from the same structures, different structures, but the same function. And there's a little cartoon here, similar due to inheritance, and here, similar due to other factors. Okay, so this is genetics, and this is something else, probably the amount of food. that is consumed. Comparative embryology is amazing. This works downwards. So there are 4 lizards, the tortoise, the pig, and us. So they're very similar at first, very similar, and they each have gill slits. You can see here. Okay, it all came through. There's a dorsal, that means back, spinal column. You can see it early on. And the progression is all there, and you can see differences between at this level and eventually close to birth, not quite birth yet. Okay, so we have, by comparative embryology, you can see how close we are to the pig embryologically, or in many other ways too, but we are nowhere near the reptile and the 2 reptiles here. Now they're close and we're close. So this shows you what's called comparative embryology. It takes 3 months for a human embryo to become a distinctive human. At 3 months, the embryo is no longer called an embryo, it's called a fetus. Okay, so this one here is certainly less than 3 months. We have vestigial functions. That means functions that were useful once in our heritage, a long time ago, but have no function now, nothing useful. So we have nectar-taking membranes. So for example, in our eyes, if you look inside above the nose, the little yellow spot there, that's the remains of a membrane that used to cover the eyes. Now, if you have a cat and the cat is just sleeping there, minding its own business, sometimes it will open its eyelid, just to check that everything's cool, but you'll see that it's got a membrane across. You may or may not have seen it. And that's called the nectar-taking membrane. Camels actually have a voluntary effect on the nectar-taking membrane. Camels can walk through a sandstorm with the eyelids open, but they put up the nectar-taking membrane, which they move across. So they can see shapes. They can see that they don't bump into a palm tree or whatever, a person or the back of a camel in front of them. They can see enough. Our teeth, for example, we all have canine teeth unless they've been pulled out. They're no longer useful to us. We have an appendix. And we can say it doesn't have any use to us, but very, very recent research seemed to indicate that our appendix might have something to do with the immune system. We have in the abdomen, we have these special muscles here, which are very, very important in animals on all fours to keep the abdomen in from sort of dropping. So when some guys do a lot of work in the gym, you can see their abs rippling, and they work on those muscles, but they're not particularly useful except for showing off. Men have nipples. We have, which is not particularly useful on us. We still have some hair on our bodies, totally not useful to us. We have muscles that, we still have the muscles that, dogs and cats and other animals move their ears around. We have those muscles. They're totally useless. We also have, what are they called? Tiny muscles attached to every one of our hairs. So when you get to the cold, time winter, and you get goosebumps, the goosebump is that, I'm trying to think of a name and I can't, not coming, but it pulls on the bottom of the hair to lift it. And the idea is so hairy animals, furry animals can raise, and birds can raise their fur or their feathers to trap air, which is a wonderful insulator. And that's what our body tries to do, insulate the arm, but the hairs are pretty useless for that. Oh, and also, the coccyx is the remnant of tails, but a number of bones which are fused together. Now, observed natural selection in the middle to late 19th century, around the Industrial Revolution, 1860s-ish. There were two types of moths in England, and there were darker form and a lighter form. And also this darker form became more prominent. And these were called peppered moths because they looked like salt and pepper. So in the first report of the darker colored peppered moth, they didn't even know they existed. In 1848, by 1895, we're talking about 50 years here, in Manchester, it reached 98% of the moths that they could find in the forests around Manchester. Okay? There were light colors and dark colors. So here's a dark, this is a normal moth, and it's light colored, and it's beautifully, and you can see why it's called peppered moth, and it's beautifully camouflaged. When the Industrial Revolution started spewing out all this smoke with coal dust in it, it covered the trees. So then the light colored peppered moth was very easy picking for the birds. But next to it, if you look carefully, you'll see a dark peppered moth. And they existed early on, before the Industrial Revolution. And the dark ones were very easy to see on the light colored bark. And they were eaten. And that's why people didn't see them. So, so then because the tree was covered in soot, then the ratio of dark to light changed. Once once the Industrial Revolution was stopped and changed, and 1956, the Clean Air Act came through, the rain washed the soot away, and the light peppered moths became much larger in number, and then the dark colored moths, because it reverted back to pre-Industrial Revolution. There's nothing called biogeography. Shows, excuse me, it shows how geographically organisms have evolved. So there's lots of fossil evidence for long-term evolutionary changes and documenting how past existence of species that are now extinct. Now, the llama, the two types of camels, are the same group. So in this orange part in South America is where the llamas and what's wrong with my memory? Anyway, the other lot, can't think of it. There were two groups there, they're still there, but they went north and they called the camel family. Now, what was Russia then, and this is the Bering Strait, that used to be a one piece of land, and just crossed over, and the environment is moving along. Now, the environment in Asia was really suited, and they developed slowly into the Bactrian, the ones with the double humps, and they kept moving, and here they developed into the dromedary, the single hump. Exactly the same animals, or same heritage, if you like. But these are the modern camel family. Now, epigenetics, this is what I was saying before. This is I have to read this, a stable, heritable phenotype. Now, a phenotype, we've got two words here, not here, phenotype and genotype. The genotype is our genetic makeup. The phenotype is what the physical results are of the genes. So this is what we look like. So the phenotype results from the chromosomes without alterations in the DNA sequence. Okay, so that's what epigenetics is. It really means above or on top of the genetics. So we have our genetics in each of our cells, except the red blood cells. They don't have a nucleus, and they, within the system of the chromosomes, there are these little bits which have an effect on the genes. So these external modifications, which have come from our parent or during our own lifetime, and they can turn genes on and off. They can also, they don't change the DNA sequence, but they can change how the genes are read. So the result is not the original result. It's something a little different. So I've attached, I think, I don't know if I did. Oh gosh, I'll have a look if I did. But there's a thing on the Dutch famine and how that famine still affects people today because of the effect of the famine on those people. And if I haven't read anything on this line about the great potato famine in Ireland, when millions of the Irish left Ireland because they were starving, dying off, and so many came to Australia. I have to check, I have to follow that one up. Okay. Now, epigenetics then is, here's a chromosome. I'm sorry, a diagram of a chromosome. Here you've got the chromatin, it's all coiled up, and when it opens up, it's the DNA. And within the DNA are coiled up on these special proteins called histones. I've got a talk on genetics, purely genetics. We'll go into detail, but not now. And there are these little tails that come off. And on these tails, you get what's called the epigenetic factor. So these mechanisms, the two little bits here I need to read out, they're affected by the factors and processes which affect the development in utero and childhood. Environmental chemicals could be involved, drugs and pharmaceuticals that you've taken, the aging process, and diet. And the health endpoint, what could result: cancer, autoimmune diseases, mental disorders, and diabetes. So these epigenetic factors, and they're just even environmental things that happen during your lifetime. So you are part of living through a terrible, terrible time. And you probably all know people who have gone through the terrible times and survived the Holocaust. They have certain issues within themselves, and it could all be part of this. So it's called histone modification. It's epigenetics. So we've got the epigenetic modifications. So identical twins could evolve differently depending on their respective environment. So if, for example, identical twins are separated early on and they live in two different environments, they grow up and they are somewhat different. So it's the complex system, but it could affect their health and their behavior. So that diets and various diseases related to that, the drugs, toxins that they may be exposed to, even anxiety and stress affects this epigenetic situation. And so monozygotic twins, that means twins coming out of one egg. The large differences in their life period could develop. One could be an obese person, the other one stays thin, one could become stays sane, and the other one develop mental illness. Now, this photo I found of identical twins who were separated at birth, and they grew up in different families in different parts of America, and then later on found each other. And if you look, they're quite different. I didn't send this one, but to you, the non-notes. That's why I'm letting you sort of absorb this a little bit. Okay. Now, here's a little diagram. So there's harmful epigenetics systems like the Western diet. You get this phenotype. Phenotype is the result of the genotype. So what the genotype, our genotype could lead to obesity because of the epigenetics of the diet, and could be of the parents. And it may not be in their gene if they're identical twins. And this one is the safe diet, a Mediterranean, lots of fruit and vegetable, very little fat. They delay aging, accelerated aging, and this immune disorders and cancer, low death risk, and so on. So you get alterations, you get changes within the histones there, within the DNA. And then you get transgenerational effects. So they move from generation to generation. Yeah. I think I've said enough. Some people think, scientists, that epigenetics can even play a role in development of cancer, some cancer. So, for instance, an epigenetic change that silences a tumor suppression gene. So a tumor suppression gene is a gene that stops the growth of a possible cancer. It keeps it under control. And if the epigenetic molecule silences this particular gene, then you get uncontrolled growth. Another example, the gene that turns, the epigenetic aspect that turns off genes that help repair damaged DNA. Our DNA, every time it reproduces, could be damaged slightly, but there are other parts which actually repair it as it goes. I'll talk about genetics another time. Now, leading to an extra, a lot of DNA damage, and when you get DNA damage, you get a very great increase in cancer. Then we get, okay, that's the end of the section on evidence. Intelligent design. In the 1980s, all of a sudden, these religios started talking about creationism, and they say that they're trying to legitimize the hand of God in evolution. Okay, so this is saying that God actually controlled evolution. It's called the hand of God. And so we and all plants, all living things were designed by an intelligent being. There are some people in the world, I believe that. I'm just going to say that I put this in purely for the sake of exposing you to these two words if you haven't seen them before. So intelligent design does not exist, but there are people who believe it. Well, we've still got flat earthers too. People who believe the earth is flat. So that's the end of our talk, but I'd like to show you a couple of cartoons I've got here. Two amoeba talking, oh, I don't know, what would you like to evolve into? So this is evolution has brought up lots of, like this beauty here, this whale. How are we ever going to evolve if you people keep pushing us back into the ocean? You know, down here you can see there was a fish that looked like that, which had legs, but they were actually the fins which developed into legs and was able to breathe air that they existed. So, anyway. And ladies and gentlemen, thus endeth the lesson. Any questions? Any comments? I can't silence you, so unmute you. So if you want to say something, you'd have to press your space bar down and hold
it. Thank you for the lecture, Ruben. As always, they're always different.
Thank you, Basil. Oh, Evelyn's joined us. Lovely. Hi. Thanks very much. And I enjoyed that one. I'll enjoy all of them, but just putting it together and finding new aspects to it, it's all good. So Arthur, nice to have someone sitting behind you. Hi. And so this is the first of a series of 3 talks. The next one, I'm looking at human evolution specifically, after having all this background. And then the one after that, while I was doing the human one, I thought of Aborigines. One of the subjects I did back in uni days was anthropology, and the whole semester was on Aboriginal society. It wasn't part of the science faculty, just it was something that interested me, so I did that as well. But from that, I have such good memories. I thought I developed a talk about Aboriginal technologies, and that'll be the one after that. And I haven't thought any further on from that. So,
Ruben, sorry that I missed the start, but